Jane, I'll pass the floor to you to get your comments, and particularly given that you have been working in Armenia for a number of years in a variety of respects as well, and just your thoughts on the work that Human Rights Watch in particular has done in the country.
Okay, thank you very much, Susan, and to everyone. It's nice to see you here and to have been invited. I appreciate the dialogue. So I'll just say briefly about Human Rights Watch. For those of you who don't know, Human Rights Watch is an independent, non-governmental, nonpartisan organization. We work around the world in about 90 countries where we do research and advocacy on human rights abuses and from the perspective of international law and standards and countries' compliance with those standards and treaties to which they've committed themselves. So Human Rights Watch has been working on different aspects of the situation in Armenia for over 25 years. We try to the extent possible, support very much the work of local organizations that are on the front lines, documenting and advocating for change. So I wanted to speak primarily today about the events of July 29th and the broader protests in July. I was together with a colleague, was there for several days at the end of July and early August, where we interviewed dozens of victims and witnesses to the events, particularly on July 29th and the police dispersal of what was a largely peaceful protest. We also interviewed journalists, lawyers, doctors, and others who could comment on the situation or who experienced particular events that night. And we also visited the site where in Saritagh neighborhood where the most violent dispersal took place. So just for a bit of context, in terms of international standards, protests that are peaceful, even if they are unauthorized by the authorities, really should be tolerated by the authorities to the maximum extent. If any parts of a protest are violent, or if there are violent actors within that protest, they should be isolated, and proportional measures should be taken to reduce any violence that takes place, to allow a peaceful protest to go on. So that's sort of the basic context that we're evaluating this protest from in terms of international standards and compliance with those standards. And what we documented on the night of July 29th, I think what everyone here is aware, several hundred people gathered in the Saritagh neighborhood of the Erebuni district of Yerevan. There had been protests for several weeks following the armed takeover of the police station in Erebuni. Those protests were overwhelmingly peaceful. There had been very thorough documentation of the events by group NGOs, by journalists, largely without interference. But there was something radically different on the night of July 29th. So the situation was tense at moments that evening, but when the police decided to conduct their operation, there was no adequate warning given to disperse the crowd. There were no warnings, clear warnings that force would be used against people. And there was no measured escalation in terms of the measures used by the police to attempt to disperse the crowd. So what we documented is that police immediately resorted to the use of stun grenades. These were both rocket-launched and hand-thrown stun grenades. They are a crowd dispersal measure that we see used in many different situations, but in different countries. But what we determined in this situation is that as a result of because of the injuries that these stun grenades caused, both first and second degree burns, fragmentation wounds, some of them very serious, and other serious bodily harm, including one case of a young man losing an eye, that this measure was disproportionate. There was a misuse of these weapons and as a crowd control measure, and should be a central part of any investigation going forward, whether they should be used at all, and in what way they should be used, if ever. So after the launch of these stun grenades directly into crowds, which landed on people or right in front of them, the police launched an attack on the protesters. beating and detaining people in a very indiscriminate way. There were no attempts to disperse them other than through these very punitive attacks. Another quite troubling aspect of that night was the large number of people in civilian clothing who were working in conjunction with police, apparently in concert with them, and the problem that this raises for accountability, which is something that we'll talk about also in this today's discussion. So another key aspect of what happened on July 29th was the attacks, deliberate attacks on journalists. As I mentioned, there had been very thorough coverage by many news outlets for a number of nights leading up to July 29th. There had been little interference, if any, on the work of journalists. But on July 29th, police had asked journalists to step aside to what they claimed to be a more secure area in advance of launching the operation. But what happened, in fact, was that that area in which the journalists were standing was one of the first areas to be targeted by the stun grenades and by the police attack. And journalists were also beaten, their equipment confiscated and damaged. We saw later that the president apologized to journalists for some of the actions that happened that night, but of course this is not sufficient for accountability. I'll say a few words also about detentions. That night, again, as on previous occasions of protests in 2016 and other years, the authorities arbitrarily detained hundreds of people. Many of them were beaten. Many of them did not receive prompt or adequate medical treatment. Some of the injuries were quite severe, including one man who we interviewed who had multiple fractures to his jaw as a result of beatings and punches and kicks. In at least two cases, many people, and in one case over 100 people, were held in a gymnasium for over 12 hours. And in other cases, people held for 12 hours or more, despite the legal requirement that after 3 hours, a person should be released or charged. So overwhelmingly, people were released after the detention, but at least 40 people were charged with criminal charges. Many people were denied access to a lawyer of their choosing. They were not allowed to inform their relatives. We documented many cases in which relatives desperately searched for their loved ones who had been detained, only learning many days later about the detention and therefore not being able to help supply adequate legal counsel to those detained. Among those who are facing criminal charges are several protest leaders. From our documentation of what happened on the night of July 29th, we consider that many of the charges brought against the leaders to be disproportionate and unjustified. Many people are facing charges for quote-unquote mass disorder, which carries punishment of up to 10 years. From our evidence, there is nothing that happened that night that would justify such a charge of mass disorder, given that the protest was largely nonviolent. And finally, in terms of the detentions, we saw the really sweeping use of pretrial detention for those charged with crimes. Pretrial detention should be a measure of last resort. Prosecutors and judges should look for other measures, restraining measures, for those who are charged with crimes. We saw that prosecutors did not provide any facts in pretrial hearings to support the need for custody. Now, some of those who were sentenced to pretrial detention have been released, but a number have not. And we have been calling for those restraining measures to be reviewed and for the the least restrictive measures that are consistent with the charges to be taken against those people. While we were in Yerevan in early August, we did meet with the Special Investigation Service, which is responsible for investigating police crimes allegedly committed by police and other authorities. We raised our concerns very much with them. We learned that several investigations have been opened into the incidents of July 29th, including a specific investigation looking at the conduct against journalists, interference with journalist activities, as well as other events, other protests and police actions in July. We will be continuing to monitor and look at the nature of these investigations. We've seen in many years past that although investigations have been opened, very minimal results have come out of those investigations. This is a really key aspect of not only accountability for those crimes, but ensuring that there's actually public trust in the government for when something like this does happen, when a tense situation is not de-escalated as the authorities should be seeking to do, but that there is meaningful accountability. We know that shortly after these events, the Yerevan police chief was dismissed. Dismissals of officials can, in many cases, not really efficient as a measure of restoring public trust, ensuring true accountability. I think the public really seeks, and it would be consistent with the Armenian government's human rights commitments, for a full and transparent investigation, a real report as to what went wrong, what measures are being taken to prevent this from happening again. The dismissal of officials, simply leaves the impression that, that power is concentrated in a few hands who can determine sort of who stays and who goes. And that does very little to ensure public trust and confidence in the government.
Great. Thank you, Jane, for that.